anything come up when you hear that song, Sympathy for the Devil?
I remember where I was when I bought the album.
Okay. Okay, that's great. We are going to talk about story today, so that's great. Anything else? Anything of the lyrics that was repeated that stood out? So the part, oh, go ahead, Heather.
Sorry,
No
I
problem.
was just one thing that stood out to me was, the repeated refrain of what's puzzling you is the nature of my game. And it was making me think of Maya and, like the illusion of the universe. That's all I got.
Okay, that's exactly what I was going for. So we're going to talk about that idea of what's puzzling us about our own nature, that we may call evil or the devil or this illusion or duality of good and bad. You will encounter this in yourself and in your clients repeatedly. And in essence, this is the message of tonight. So we'll tie it into belief change, behavior change, different practical applications, but ultimately that's a big message here. So let me share the screen and we shall start. So as I said before, this is a small component of a much larger consciousness coaching program. And it's about belief change, not behavior change. Now, facetiously, I say to you and to clients, behavior change doesn't matter, belief does. And that is true. And ultimately, behavior change does matter, but not ultimately and not initially. And we'll talk a little bit about why. We're also going to talk about meaning, because meaning really is that bridge of what we can assist clients in achieving so that the belief sticks, the change sticks, that then will lead to behavior change. I took this larger program and I tailored it to you since you're health coaching. If there are questions or if something seems a small piece of something larger, please do not hesitate to ask questions. If the time doesn't allow, I can always send your instructor some additional resources and materials. There's no shortage of that. So just keep that in mind when questions come up. So what I'd like to cover tonight are the universal laws that we're going to use for the topic at hand, the current coaching situation, why all coaching is spiritual coaching, that's ultimately the messaging here. The trans-theoretical model of behavior change, I mentioned to you that I had a master's in public health, and that was an area of expertise of mine. So I'm bringing that in since I believe that you have been covering behavior change models. Why behavior change doesn't matter. The importance of meaning and connection for client changes. Then we will have coaching applications, things that you can take to your sessions for application, some practice. And then I created a section that's for coaches only to bring this back home to yourself, because ultimately all of this is about ourselves. So the objectives are to explain why all coaching is spiritual coaching, expand your awareness around belief change as the link to behavior change, understand the importance of attaching meaning to create ongoing change, and engage in practices to understand belief change. Any questions about what tonight we'll cover? So let's start with universal law. When we're talking about spirituality, we tend to hear laws like law of vibration, law of attraction. And it's interesting because these laws are universal for a reason. No matter what course of study, physics, metaphysics, it's all relatable. And so I like to start all lectures off with the relevant universal laws that we'll talk about that will then tie in to more of the psychological or public health applications. So I'd like to bring your attention to 3 particular laws. The first law is the largest law of all the universal laws. It's think of like the most global, if you will, and it's called the principle of mentalism. In essence, the take-home message of this is that thoughts create our reality. We've heard this said by multiple philosophers, including Buddha, and this idea that the reality that we're living, our so-called life or conflicts and situations, are produced by our thoughts, and hence the tie-in to belief change. Another law that has become pretty popular is known as the principle of vibration, and linked to Einstein, that everything vibrates, that nothing is at rest. And so a belief that we're ever static or stuck is just created from the mind. Everything is vibrating, everything is constantly in movement, and we're going to talk about movement through a horizontal axis for behavior change that originates from a movement from belief change. And the third law is the law of octaves. This is a pretty rare law, and it's not found in most of the spiritual texts overtly. And I've simplified it for you this evening with 3 shapes, and we'll talk about that. But it's the only law that actually speaks on how to transmute consciousness, meaning transmute our belief, our mental sort of consciousness, to sustain belief change, thereby sustaining behavior change. So it's obscure, I've simplified it, and hopefully that can use as a visual model for you to start understanding the relationship between mind, body, and spirit, which is encompassing all of the health coaching and the wellness wheel that we'll talk about. Any questions about those laws? So let's bring this into our current coaching situation. We want to place things in a container. And so let's talk a little bit about why you're all here. So the need for health coaches. I was reading an article, and it was a doctor who had started studying family medicine. At the time, family medicine back in the early 2000s was starting to be a branch so that it would fulfill the need that other specialty areas were not fulfilling. She was very disillusioned by her experience in practice and joined some integrative health teams and putting together a lot of mind, body, spirit practices. This idea of the integrative health coach emerged. And the idea is that the coach would be someone to walk side by the patient, allowing the patient to be responsible for his or her own choices and at the pace in which they're ready to change. A trusted companion on the path that perhaps can hold a larger vision for the client as they go through certain steps of the journey. And they term this the integrative health coach. Since this, we've seen an explosion of coaching. I was telling your instructor the other day that I was getting my PhD. I graduated in 2009. This was just starting. And I remember telling my dissertation instructor, I think I'm going to go into coaching because this is going to be a big thing. And she kind of rolled her eyes like, I'm getting a PhD. Why would I need to do this? And we see a lot of overlap in a lot of professionals going into this because perhaps we have want more one-on-one with our clientele. We want to really be a person that walks the path with our clients. So there's definitely a need for this, and it's answering a call that many of us have and a question that our healthcare current system is failing at, and health coaches is filling that gap. So this was a study. I have the citation down here in American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine that said recent results in 2017 that biomarkers, blood pressure, cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, glucose, these physical attributes that we attribute to health or illness were improved by the assistance of having a health coach walk the walk with the client. So we start to see the larger perspective of perhaps larger life problems come down into a more health-focused lens. And we're going to talk about the wellness wheel and what this health, not necessarily the definition of health, each of you will have your own, but one of the things I do with clients and the coaches that I train is have them define a definition of health, because it's not just merely the absence of illness. And so the wellness wheel answers a lot of that and some of the things that we'll talk about, the various areas, that it's not just limited to the physical symptomology or blood markers that can indicate that your services were rendered useful. And the growth. In 2021, it was a $14 billion market. And by 2030, it's expected to be a $25 billion market. So this is growing, it's not going anywhere. Some of the types of coaching are preventative and others are more management if the symptoms are already presented in the client. One of the things that I really liked about this research was that the growth is attributed to a lot of the removal of the regulatory roadblocks, the red tape, insurance, and so forth. And so the broad reach, even across county and country lines, is available to us. And we start to see the globalness, if you will, of the need for this. And I mention this because what I want to talk about today is this idea of wholeness, of integrating all of it, even the sympathy for the devil, this thing that we might consider, as the song says, the nature of the devil's game, and this animal nature, lower nature, desirous nature, and inner struggles that we have. And I think that is part of the larger messaging of health coaching. It's not only a field that can reach, not be boundaried in by a certain geographic location, that it's going to explode and has been exploding everywhere. But that's the take-home message of today, is that the thoughts, the behaviors are limited by boundaries, and part of the evening is to educate you that those boundaries don't need to exist, only those that we decide to implement. So I brought in the wellness wheel, which is something that you're probably familiar with, to identify sections of health or wellness. And I see something in the behaviors. For instance, if we're talking about the physical or the diets, we might remove sugar but add water. Exercise, some more physical. We might add cardio and remove the laziness of sitting and binge, watching Netflix. The stress mediators, you might remove anxiety and add meditation as a result. If you're looking at the environmental impact, maybe you're somebody who picks up plastic and adds recycling to your life. Financial health, you might add zeros to your balance sheet and reduce your debt. And emotional health adds boundaries and removes perhaps passive aggressiveness. So we see this take away and add, this removal or addition, to identify a concept of wellness and health. Any comment on that? Does that strike anything with anybody? I see some heads. So the 4 pillars of health coaching are mindful presence, self-awareness, authentic communication, and offering a safe and sacred place to your clients. And we're going to kind of go back and forth to this model, and you'll see that they're all circles. And I'm going to go into these 3 shapes that I identify with this law of actives, which is the consciousness expansion, the belief change, and then understandably the behavior change to stick. So health coaching, is it spiritual coaching? In that wellness wheel, spirituality was one of the components. And that's a question for tonight, and maybe get you thinking on, are you a spiritual coach? What component of your coaching practice is spiritual? So I have some questions. What is spirituality? How do you know? Is something added or removed in order to be spiritual? And what does it look like? And so I'd like a little bit of feedback on what comes to mind when you hear these questions. I don't see anybody unmuting.
I look at it, even though I've actually treated it as a separate component. Now that you're bringing this all up, I actually do feel it's an integration, because what our beliefs and our level of consciousness integrates into every aspect of the other parts of the wheel. And it goes with behavior change, it goes with belief system. I mean, I don't think you can separate it.
Okay, thank you.
Kelsey? Yeah, I think for me, I'm very much in agreement with sort of the way Kamina is talking about it. For me, it really is about the ability to live like authentically to your values in a really intentional way. And I think that, yeah, I do think that there's a component of that is integrated into every dimension of wellness, that authenticity.
Okay, so I hear integration, I hear consciousness, I hear authentic living or living authentically, intentionality. And we use these words pretty liberally, right? This is the language that we're in. Those of us attracted to this type of field, the world is kind of moving in this language. We're in a very new agey culture. And so does that require removing something or adding something? How do you know when you're authentic? How do you know when you're integrated, when you've expanded consciousness? Like, what is that material, if there is, gauge?
I was thinking,
oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Please go ahead.
okay, thank you. I was thinking that what is added is a belief in something or in yourself, and what is removed is doubt. And like doubt for behavior change and things like that.
Okay, great. Heather?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for me, like spirituality it's kind of like filling a void. I definitely notice when I'm kind of lacking in that area is there's just a void inside that I know is needing to be filled. So I would say probably adding something, whether that be a behavior or an intention or just simply an awareness.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a bunch of practices to do, and you don't have to share all along, but if you're following along, just kind of involve yourself in the practices so that you can connect to the content. So take out a piece of paper and draw a horizontal line, and we'll see some of this when we go to the practical section. And identify what is added on one end of the line and what is removed. So I believe it was Michelle said that she added a belief in self and removed doubt, right? So self-doubt, self-belief. A void versus filling the void. So anchor yourself into that horizontal line. There's an added awareness of a reality or perception of something outside of ourselves or our immediate experience. Okay, so Joy, you can put internal versus external, or something outside of yourself versus only being fulfilled with ourselves. Try to identify and anchor into that horizontal line so that you have just opposing concepts that perhaps something needs to be removed or added. And this is very personal, okay? So why all coaching is spiritual coaching? So in talking to your instructor, there was a little bit of a study that was performed that of the coaching clients, and this was a very small, not empirical study or, you know, anything statistically significant, but it was sort of what I pulled out to develop this, was that out of 14 coaching clients that were observed, 12 were not asking to work on physical health, but rather whatever that was for them, that definition was not provided to me, that 12 out of the 14 wanted a version of spiritual health, not physical health. And so ultimately, each and every one of you, no matter what your specific area of preference will be, or specialization, these teachings and this component to your practice will exist, whether it's spoken of or not. And so I want to go a little deeper into that. So there are 7 categories on the wheel. And I'd like for you to tell me where they fall into. What falls under spiritual, what falls under mental, what falls under emotional, and what falls under physical. Any guesses?
It seems to me like there would be multiple places for each thing. I mean, obviously emotional is going to fall under emotional, but that could also be under, in my mind, spiritual and mental.
Okay, anyone else?
To me, it's a Venn diagram. They all overlap.
Okay, so everything that's mental is physical, is emotional, is spiritual?
Yes.
Okay, great. Anyone else? Okay. So, Steph, you're not wrong, but for just the focal point of getting kind of honed in on the law of octaves, we're going to speak in terms of 3 shapes. Circle being spiritual, the triangle being thought or belief, and the square being more of the physical, environmental, the world that we would consider more material. And I use that word intentionally. The spiritual is represented by a circle because it's not necessarily seen as manifest until a thought begins. And I'm going to have another diagram shortly. Once that thought becomes filled in, then it starts to create the external life, the health issues, the relationship problems, our religious conflicts, our money and budgetary conflicts. So it starts to take on more shape. So in this wheel, financial, environmental, social, physical, goals and aspirations, and emotional. So I think it was Heather who mentioned emotional being more with mental. Actually, emotional is actually more with the physical. Emotions are attached to the bodies as desires. So it's one of the reasons why I wanted to play that song. So when he says, what's puzzling you is the nature of my game, that's the problem. Our problem is that the square, the problems we show up to therapy for or coaching for, are all about our nature. And if we go upstream, they're all spiritual. And so the key component for tonight, really the take home, is about this wholeness and integration. And so authenticity or intentionality or expanded consciousness, all those words that were used earlier, really go back to the circle, along with all of the scenarios in that song. And we'll get there in a moment. So these are materialized conflicts, and they're considered the body or the material, the matter. And the body or the matter is the loyal servant of the psyche. And none of these fall into here specifically. So that's why I have a question mark. And if we do not address the belief that emerges from something spiritual, the belief problem, our behavior change will not stick. So that's why the title is Behavior Change Doesn't Matter. We've got to focus on belief change, where they come from, why they're here, what happened, why this nature of ourselves, of the devil, puzzles us so much. It literally is the puzzle. So the hypothesis that I present tonight is one of totality. Could it be that spirituality simply is what is, the totality of what is, that line, the doubt and the belief in self, the void, the emptiness, the filling of it and the leaving it empty? Could it be an acceptance of your reality, whatever that is? A shattering of the illusions that you have of how you want the world to be rather than its nature? Is spirituality and change, belief, behavior, spirituality, all of the totality of all of this, is it ever finished? Is that square ever really complete? And is there a connection to a self, to a central axis that's self? And are we ever really in a finality with that relationship? So that's the hypothesis I present tonight. It's for you to decide. I used this image because this is the spiral. The spiral is the way that we grow spiritually. We grow spiritually, circularly, spirally, going up and going down. We do not grow linearly. And so judgment around if we're growing up or growing down, if we're going outer or inner, are part of the spiritual problem. And so they reflect in the square, in our earthly world, in our conflicts, relationship, money, health, sex, illness, disease, because we're expecting this sort of square, right? Straight lines, fits nicely. And unless we go to the thought, the triangle that really just emerges from the circle, which is at the center here, which is the center of self, we're in a constant conflict with just the reality that is. And we want the nature of the beast, the nature of ourselves, the nature of the devil to be different than what it is. So this idea of growing spiritually and circularly is spiritual time, spiritual growth. And I want to share a little story. This is an image that is used a lot in spiritual growth. And there is a contemplative tool known as the labyrinth. And the labyrinth is not a maze. It's not a trick. It has one way in, one way out. And at the center is a circle or petals to indicate the center of self, the divine, that filling of the void or the emptiness of oneself, however you like to phrase it in your particular language. And I was doing an evening called Four Shamans one night a few years ago. And I suffered from a severe depression 7 years ago. I had cancer, my life fell apart, and I lost my hair, I lost everything that I thought had value. This was right before that happened to me. So I'm having this evening, it's myself, a shaman, and 3 other shamans, and we're having stations, and all the people that come are going to do a different healing in between. And one of the stations in between was this labyrinth. So I was on pause and I went to walk the labyrinth, and it was very dark at night. And I walk in to the labyrinth, and the circles around the labyrinth are called circuits. And I'm at the most outer circuit, and one of the tree branches is covering me. It's pitch black. And I start crying and crying and crying. And literally it was this much of a 32-foot labyrinth. It was literally like 6 to 12 inches. And I could not get a hold of the pain and the fear and the worry that I was experiencing. And when I got past that part of the labyrinth and I reached the center, of course, contemplating what just happened, I hear a voice tell me that the further out you think you are from the center is really how much closer you are to the center. And so this idea of growing cyclically and spherically, we have this idea that when we're so far, we're far, when really that's probably the closest that we are to ourselves. So it allows to situate things circularly and give a different dimension to hierarchy, and what's below and what's above, and when I'm feeling good and when I'm feeling bad, when we think of growth in this time. And that's exactly what happened. Not much after that, I got my first diagnosis. My entire life fell apart. I must have died 3 or 4 times on my couch. And then one day I was done. And so that linear time, that was a good 3 years, that 1 inch of my 32-foot labyrinth of my life, who knows how many years I have, I've had 50 already, is really a very small component. And from there, everything that I had studied, all my education, everything that I had created in my brain, all the years of teaching, of administration, of all the degrees, started taking form. Because sometimes it's connecting with that illusion, connecting to the disillusion or the real nature of oneself that puzzles oneself, that appears to be where we're least spiritual. I didn't read during that time. I could do nothing but watch The Big Bang Theory during that time. I couldn't listen to music during that time. There was not a spiritual bone, if you will, in my body. Turned out to be the most spiritual time of my life. So keep that in mind when we're creating a container for yourself or a client of what that circle is and what it can offer, even if it's not in the way you want. Hence the lyrics, are you puzzled by the nature of the game? So all coaching is spiritual coaching, because ultimately it's an attempt at a return to wholeness. And we'll talk about what wholeness entails in a moment. So if we look at the circle as the totality of the experience, all of it, we look at the belief as the bridge, then wellness makes sense as the sections of one's life, not independently, but yes, overlapping, but with a common belief in tow. It is the bridge from your current conflict and issues to your quote unquote spiritual or self nature, disillusioned reality, principle self. There is an overlapping belief. And ultimately in coaching, that's the job. The job is to keep bringing it into that belief. What is the belief? What is the belief that is driving the behavior? That's the totality that we're seeking for ourselves and for our client. Any questions so far? So I'm going to go into some of the teachings and then we'll go into practical. So I'm sure you've learned about the TTM, the Trans-Theoretical Model of Behavior Change. It's probably one of the most popular behavior change models. I did my master's thesis on this model. It's by Prochaska and De Clemente. And what it says is that behavior change has 5 stages. Pre-contemplation. They probably won't show up at your office at this stage, but maybe it shows up as they work with you on another issue. Contemplation, you're beginning to contemplate change. Preparation, you're getting ready to implement something, the action step, changing the diet, adding the water, adding the recycle bin, whatever that is, and then maintenance. And maintenance is usually coupled with termination and relapse because the model does not address what is missing. And one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is what is missing is meaning. True behavior change that leads or originates from belief change that goes back up to the spiritual totality, the wholeness of oneself, requires some meaning. This can't all be meaningless. So, where are you in your current behavior change journey? Who's trying to work on something? Anything? How long have you been battling that same demon of your nature? Is it new? Is it old? Is it related? Is it not? Where are you? No one's battling anything? Escapism. Okay, thank you, Luna. So escapism. So how long have you been battling escapism?
I'm in my studio, so it's a bit loud, but for so long. I think as long as I can remember, ever since I've had responsibility.
Okay, so responsibility. So there's a start to begin the overlap. Responsibility, the belief around responsibility leads to a behavior of escapism. The client is going to tell you within the first 5 minutes what the issue is. Trust me, we'll get to the listening as. So right there, just in her statement. The reason I had you draw that line is because the duality that is formed within us of the belief around our nature, of our devilish nature, like the song states, is on a line of extremes or somewhere on that. And so responsibility and escapism in her language immediately were plotted. And if you start listening, you'll start hearing the client unfold. We're going to get to story in a bit, and I have things to say about story, but it does serve a purpose. Thank you for sharing. So why behavior change doesn't matter? I mentioned before that what's missing is meaning. If we do not deconstruct the attachment that we have to the old behavior and attach new meaning, which is expanding of consciousness and new belief system, it doesn't stick. One of the things that we help clients do, and even though they are the agents of their change, is ask questions, is listen, is offer different hypotheses. Just, have you thought about this? And that's the container that we create for the client. So perhaps a new belief system and a new worldview can begin to emerge. A new belief, a new thought that brings about new meaning. It also brings a client closer to reality and not the illusion of the reality that they want it to be. That's why my hypothesis included, could it be a shattering of illusions? Could it be accepting the reality of how things just are rather than the way that you want them to be? And so this requires meaning and connection, and it's typically with themselves. Maybe you as a mirror, right? Part of that container in a coaching dynamic is what we call a tenemos, which is we create a container where there's no time, there's no space. It's just sort of a healing space, and things start to happen. So from that container, perhaps it comes into themselves, or just offering an expanded container by asking questions or bringing in a piece of literature or showing them a different story is what creates the expansion in consciousness. And it's the buy-in to the new worldview, to a new reality that allows for greater thought expansion that allows for a deeper meaning of what all of this is. So making meaning. Clients come with a world view. It will be woven into everything they say, they do, they wear, they eat. We do not escape this worldview. Someone mentioned earlier that spirituality was an integration, that consciousness seeped into all aspects. That's what we're talking about, a worldview, and it seeps into everything. And one of the things that we recognize in ourselves or in another, when they're out of the context or the container of that traditional worldview, is, oh, that doesn't add up. They perhaps did the opposite. So that's where your line comes in. We're listening for a duality. We're listening for opposites. That's called attention. And where there's a tension of opposites creates what is known as a liminal space. I'll show you something in a little while. And that is where there's an opportunity for change. That's what you get to listen for, so that you can get an opportunity to enter that liminal space that's being created by the tension of opposites, so that something can shatter and a new worldview and a new meaning and a new belief can enter. Typically, the client has a very strong, life-destroying belief system that is either good or bad. And if you listen to the song, what's puzzling you is the nature of the game. How can you have sympathy for the devil? The title is so brilliant. When he's there just touting off all the evil, all the bad stuff that he's participated in. He was there when Pilate accused Jesus. And so the thoughts that attach us to this supposed nature of what we are or are not are life destroying. And so part of a coaching paradigm is to give a new path, a life affirming path. And that only comes with a new paradigm, a new belief, and new meaning. We're going to talk about what they were taught, what was the client taught, because that is ultimately what needs to shatter so that they can live authentically and live centered in self. So making meaning. I use this image of the David because Michelangelo said that when he got the slab of clay, the David was already in it. And all he did was chip away at what it wasn't, and that it was already in there. And when I go back to that story of the labyrinth, I was already there, but I had a lot of chipping to do, perhaps the way I thought the world worked, or the illusion I was in, or the lies that I told myself about my nature. And so the more we chip away, it's almost oxymoronic, at the larger slab, that circle expands, the consciousness expands, our fullness expands, our void perhaps expands, but also our connection to the void, the emptiness expands. And these are the concepts you see in Buddhism and in Hinduism and in philosophy, that what's full is empty. And so this is what we're trying to achieve. And that horizontal line has some truth on both ends. And what can we chip away at both aspects to get closer to perhaps a circle, a more circular vision and spherical vision of oneself? It requires a choice. This is not something that you can do for anybody. Choice is probably the hardest thing that you will encounter with clients, is them making a choice to change. And I'm talking about choosing a new worldview, choosing mistakes, choosing to remove perfectionism, choosing to actually use their fire, their passions, their desire, their nature to create the life that's there for them. That is the hardest thing I will tell you with clients. And that allows a new belief system to enter.
I have a question.
Yes.
So it sounds like in order to do this type of process with a client, that the questions would bring us as a coach working and connecting with the client in a deeper level than what we maybe have. And I know we're just being exposed to this. Or I'm just wondering where the difference is in the technique. Not that I'm asking you to take us there, but is there a real big difference between how you move in this direction with a client with a higher purpose, because you're really working on consciousness and belief system and all of this? So I don't know if I made sense, but
Yeah, you made perfect
Yeah.
sense, and it's a great question. I do have a bunch of practical aspects for you towards the end, because it is a very fine line. The container that the coach offers, and it's in the definition, is a new life path, a movement forward. And a lot of times in counseling, you spend a lot of time in the past. So this isn't about rehashing. I'm not about the rehashing of the story. We use the story to give us information to move forward. But I also want to explain that the path forward isn't linear. And so if a client gets stumbled with, your guidance, that isn't a failure. That isn't that they've backtracked. It's a visual to provide that all of it is forward motion. And so it's important to situate in the definition of what a coach is. In counseling, a lot of it, especially psychodynamic or analytic psychology, which is sort of my area of expertise, we spend a lot of time in the past. In my paradigm, I've created my own models that are rooted in subconscious that begin at the origin, which would be conception. But I don't stay there. I can use any story that happened to you today and link it to the conception, because that doesn't change, but it's a continuous momentum forward. And that really is the decisive factor between coaching and counseling. Does that help? Okay. So the new worldview, and yes, you are working with them at a deeper level, and that's my hope. I don't do shallow. So you'll get there. And I have something reflexive for yourself too, because that's going to be part of the growth. Who I was at the beginning to who I was last year to now is a completely different person, right? So there's a reflective action in the experience with the client as well. So there's always growth for ourselves too, and the deeper we go. So helping the client update their worldview. Sometimes it's just bringing them in an article or sharing how it's done somewhere else. Well, is it universal? Is that the only way to mother? Is that the only way to sister and brother? Is that the only way to be a wife? So we get very stuck in a worldview because of what we were told is the nature of the role. And again, I go back to that song because it's the nature that puzzles us. And there's not just one way to skin the cat, right? All roads lead to Rome, as they say. And as long as the road is cyclical and spherical and in movement, not static, you're on that way to self. And along the way, illusions must be shattered. And disillusionment and new meanings and expanded consciousness are required for that to hold and create long-lasting behavior change. And so one of my sayings is, it's your truth, not the truth. And if you cannot bring it back to the 8 universal truths, it's your truth, it's not the truth. And so you can call BS on, yeah, no, that's not the only way that's done. And that's one strategy. Well, for homework, can you find how it's done somewhere else? In another tradition, in another religion, in another gender, in another diet protocol? Because we get very attached. Now, please do not think that I'm going to just leave you in the land of nothingness, because that is not my style. I'm not about, oh, let's expand consciousness without a container. The world is here, it is now, and we need that square. But that square is called a value system. when the client is living in the entirety of their value system, where they have challenged why they believe what they believe, and now have reestablished on something more solid, something more authentic. So this is not about living in la la land in the ether. That is not my thing at all. And that is oftentimes what's touted as spiritual, and it's not. A spiritual belief system in a construct has very much a manifest form. And the form is, once you expand consciousness on the limitations, is going back into what is authentic for oneself, and that is a value system. So this isn't about, oh, everyone does it differently, so don't have a rule book. No. Step 6 in my model is have a rule book, but it's defined by you, on your truths, on your value system, after you have questioned the limiting beliefs that you're buying into, that were not yours to begin with. So I want to share a case study. I'm just going to kind of bring it up now and hear your thoughts, and then we'll bring her back at the end. Rosa is a client. She's 30 pounds overweight, and every time she tries to drop more than 5 pounds, she can't. She gets stuck. So she's seeking the book, the pill, the YouTube video. She's got it all. And she can't get past that 5 pounds. She's currently 60 years old, a mother, a wife, a daughter. This is how she identifies, as a caretaker. And so my question to you is, just with this little bit of information, what belief might she be attached to? What in this story might be so sacred that gives her permission or certainty or the need to hold on to the weight? And does she lose anything if she loses the weight? Does she gain anything if she loses the weight? Thoughts?
I'm thinking like food and caretaking, like she might cook for other people.
Okay. So what's the belief? Because you could cook and not eat, anorexia, right? So what's the belief that you're contemplating? You're in an area. What's the belief that can be contemplated here that losing weight and cooking for others is an identification with a role, with a belief and attachment? Chelsea?
For me, it could possibly be like I'm worth more to others in service to others. And so the room and space that I'm allowed to take up for my own needs is very small. So if I were to cook and not eat, or make foods that maybe felt better in my body, I would be selfish. And so that would decrease the value that I pose and get in my relationship with others.
Okay. So on that horizontal line, if the abundance or the 100 of that line, right, the all consuming of the line is others matter, then perhaps what's positioned at the other end, based on what you're saying, is I can't take up perhaps space in which I'm nurtured. So food fills that. And physically, I take up space that I can't take up with emotion because that's reserved for others. Okay. So we start to see in just a very short 2-minute synopsis that we're anchoring a belief system that could possibly be true. So with just that, that's enough to start asking questions, to prompt belief system questions, to prompt values. What were you taught? What was the value of food? Was there food in your childhood, right? So now we can get into scarcity, we can get into quality of foods. Do you allow yourself healthy foods? Do you go to fast foods? And now we're getting a larger picture around that square. Rosa just wants to lose weight, because it's never that she just wants to lose weight. There's something she's holding on to, a belief that she cannot let go of. And so that's where I want you to start thinking. And it's not about the square, it's about the triangle that ultimately, and we'll get to the circle in a minute, that is a larger comprehensive nature that we all have that we're rejecting. Thank you. So tell me a story. So I'm not a big story person for clients. You can spend a 50-minute session listening to the same story from a client in many different ways. Tamina's laughing. And the entire session is about them rehashing their story. So that's something pretty traditional in counseling, right? They get validated. Perhaps something is discovered by the stream of consciousness conversation that they have while the therapist is listening. I like to find value and extract the value in the story. So I keep the story short. I ask the client to tell me a story short, just like I gave you. Rosa, 30 pounds, caregiver, mother, sister, wife. What's the issue? It starts to build the container. I keep using this word and I use it intentionally. The spiritualness of life has no boundary. It's unmanifest, right? It's everything that is ever existed, all of it. So the container is like an outline, a sketch of the larger problem. And it helps us situate ourselves and the client so that the problem isn't so overwhelmingly big, but also not super small, like, oh, just eat greens. It gives us a better context and a better space. The word tenemos that I used earlier was from the Greek tradition. The land that was dedicated to the gods was a piece of land called the tenemos. And Carl Jung used that in his practice to explain what was happening in the dynamic in the consultation room. And so this story gives it a framework and an outline, but does not take up the entirety of the time. And that's what we want to get away from, a bit of the story, but we want to get the right things from the story. So now you have a line. So there is on Amazon these cubes that are called story cubes. And there was a program that I used to have called Tell Me a Story. And anybody can come into my classroom. They can throw the cubes. I'd ask them to give me 3 of the little images and tell me a story, anything. They had to make it up, you know, a bicycle, a sad face, and a star. Any story you tell, your nature is woven into, your extremes are woven into, your belief is woven into. And if you listen, you get it. Ultimately, coaching is presence, as that overlapping 4 circles said, the 4 pillars. Listening, awareness to the details, allowing a container, a safe space for the client to share an authentic story. That does not mean that 50 minutes out of the hour is drudging up details and the this and the that. That doesn't serve anybody. So in the Jewish text, the Jewish mysticism text of the Kabbalah, there's a book called the Zohar. And the Zohar says that every dream has a truth and a lie. Every story has a truth and a lie. And the client doesn't even know. You don't even know. When you listen, you're listening for the truth. Oh, there's a caregiver quality here. I cannot take up space. The emotional space is for everybody else. Therefore, I eat. The lie is I'm 30 pounds overweight. And so we start to situate ourselves with what is the story and what is the truth, that container. And what is the lie? Usually the lie is the square, those sections in the square, the financial, the environmental, the relationship, the health issue. Go up, up, up. So what is special about this stone? Tell me a story. No one? A sentence, just one sentence. I won't coach you, I promise. I have more to say about the stone.
The stone fell from a star and landed in my backyard.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Okay, so the stone in essence is not special, right? It's just a stone. It's just there. I mean, maybe the shape resonates with you. Maybe it fits nicely. Maybe it reminds you of something you saw, you know, when you went to some spiritual pilgrimage, right? You're going to start connecting with the stone. But the stone in essence really means absolutely nothing. It doesn't let light through. Okay, so it's dense, it's heavy, right? It's just there, just a block, not necessarily have any meaning. So what's this stone? Anyone know this stone? This stone is known as the stone of destiny. And it's used in the coronations of the monarchs. And King Charles is going to be coronated this week. And this is present at all of the coronations. There was a fight from this stone, and your instructor can speak more too, because she lived in Scotland, but I think it was taken from the Scots, and there's a big fight, and it's borrowed when there's a coronation. There's this whole cultural component to this stone. No different than this one. But now we start to layer. It has value, it has meaning, and the kings and the queens and the famous people, it's going to be on TV, and it sits on a throne, and everybody, like all of the emotion and the story. That's why the emotion, I said before, is not found in the mind and the spirit. The emotion is found in the square, in the body. 99% of that wellness wheel falls in the square. So this is an example of how something that is impersonal, it's just a stone, it's just outside, through years and years and years, through a story, through emotion, through status. One of the things I had on the earlier slide was, does she lose status? Does it identify that I'm better or worse, good or bad, abundant, scarce? Has now been layered and layered and layered to this, Lord knows how many thousands of years or hundreds of years this stone is. So if you're going to watch the coronation this week, watch for the stone. So is the stone sacred now to any of you? Now that you know that, did anything change? No. So then why do we do this with other areas in our life? Why are we so puzzled by our own stone nature, by our own devilish nature, by just our own human nature? The stone just is. There's nothing personal about it. There's no status about it, and it's not sacred. But we attach a lot of this to a story. So when we can get the client to hone in on just a short version, my sentence is, give me the conflict in one sentence. I have my clients tell me one sentence of the story. That's how tuned in I am. But if you need a few minutes, right, you're just starting, you're building the container, figure it out. It might start at 15 minutes, it might go to 40, it might get to 15. Give yourself what you need. But start paying attention to how much story you need to tell to get to your truth. Because all of it is just noise. It's building a case for, building an emotional structure for. All the lies, not the truth. And the movement forward on a straight line too, but in our spherical, cyclical format of spiritual growth is truth. That's it. That is when the disillusionment happens. The client shatters the reality, the fantasy that they live in. They own a new reality. They find meaning to that new reality. Belief change expands and behavior change sticks. So any words here? Lollipop, light bulb, car, calendar, dominoes, music, books, anything come up? Any story? One sentence.
I can say my family spent a lot of time together playing dominoes.
Okay. So there's a family component. The family immediately is going to bring in something emotional. It might be summers at the beach, right? You see how the story builds from that one sentence. I'm sure there's details that are conjured and conjured and conjured up in your head right now. When I chose that word, I also chose that. because Domino's are a big part of the Cuban culture and I'm Cuban. So we start to see how the truth gets just covered and covered and covered and covered. And a lot of health issues, I'm talking physical health issues, are that. A story I've told myself about my family, because in the family, we get a lot of our health behaviors. That's no different than money. That's no different than sex. But a lot of the health issues, if they're based on the research, are numbers, quantifiable numbers of blood and sugar and so forth. You can see why the story raptures us and we miss sight of what's really, really happening in the client and in ourselves. What about these words? Good, desire, creativity, evil, love, will. What comes up? Any word. It's impossible that one of these words does not strike something in someone. That one I'm not buying. Just one sentence.
I can't say it. The creativity poured out of her.
The creativity poured out of her. Do you know where creativity emerges from? Where it begins?
I don't know. It just is out of being allowing.
Creativity originates out of darkness, desire, and evil. We judge creative as great, but tell me any creativity that hasn't begun in the dark. So when I tell you about my labyrinth experience, a lot of creativity emerged out of that, a ton. And so when we look back at origin stories, our own included, when we look back, and this is not religion, I'm just talking about cosmology, I'm talking about philosophy, it could be religion too. Creativity is directly related to desire and evil. What's puzzling you is the nature of my game. We don't understand the origins of where that wellspring comes from, of where that self and authenticity and integrated being comes from. That's why I said we threw around authentically, intentional, integrated consciousness, but the origins is from this. It just is. There is nothing personal about creativity, and there is nothing personal about desire. And there's nothing personal about good or evil or will or love. They're impersonal constructs that come from spirituality, a circle, wholeness, totality, and why I invited the hypothesis. What happens is we add sacredness to the story, and that's why I shared the rock and the stone of destiny. Because now there's a sacredness to the coronation. How many kings and queens have there been, right? Now there's a specialness and a sacredness. And we actually believe in a very screwy way that our conflict and our problems are sacred and special. That's why it's a square and it's limited and it's not special. Find out how they do it somewhere else. All of a sudden, you're going to be like, psh. Or Google. How many people have this problem? Wow, you're not special. I grew up in a cult. Pretty common, I'll tell you. There's whole organizations about it. Ain't so special, Francis. What I do with that darkness, what I do with that origin story, what I do with that struggle becomes special. It becomes self. It becomes the way I love myself. It becomes what I create from myself. But the actual story is not special. So the behavior matters eventually. It's the consciousness and the conscientiousness of what you do with it, but not right off the bat. And so most clients don't want to do this level of work, or we've got to nudge them, right, through the container and asking the questions, listening and being present and creating a safe space to pull out the truth from the lies that they don't even know they have. So there's something in quantum physics known as the quantum collapse. And I love quantum physics because quantum physics is basically metaphysics proven in scientific terms. So I'm a metaphysician, so I use a lot of quantum physics terms. It's like, oh, that's what the spiritists have been saying forever. Everything was there. It was already there. You see it when you're ready. That's why people have aha moments. Or if you're a parent, your mom has told you 500 times, or you told your children 500 times, and they never understood it, but Tommy's mom next door said it, and all of a sudden they got it. And you're like, but I've been telling you that 500 times. That's the mother's, plight. And it's when you're ready, you're ready. And so it's always been there. And so the pillars of coaching and the container is to create the safety, to create the presence, the authenticity, the mindfulness, so that the client can get there and go, oh. And sometimes it requires you saying the same thing 10 different times, 10 different ways, or the same thing, the same way, 100 times. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I have to say it again. I have to say it again. And so that's part of, as we walk, this side by side with our client as a coach, what's required. That's the safety of the space. Like, I have to say this 500 times, and I'm going to say it 500 and 501 and 502, because that's what's required until they are ready to see it. And that is not our failure, and that is not their failure. That just is. So this is a diagram of how the belief, the triangle, and thoughts. All that is, right? There's no difference between good and evil and power and will and desire and creativity and beauty in something that you have not attached meaning to, that you have not made sacred, that you took those dominoes and added the story of the family and the summer cottage and I'm adding that stuff. You didn't say that, but you know what I mean. The details. So I give you the example of a car. A car is very impersonal. If a car were here, it'd be just as equally the weight as power and evil. It's just a car. But if you lose your virginity in the car, you have a teen pregnancy in the car, he leaves you stranded, you have to quit high school, you're a waitress at 60 years old, now that car has a lot of damn meaning. And when you see a red car passing by, you viscerally get the emotions and you're triggered and you're traumatized, right? And now you see why emotion is held in the body. And it's not a spiritual or a mental thing. The body, which is the square, is the loyal servant to the psyche. And when we attach meaning to that, that's where the stone becomes sacred and the story becomes sacred and the lie becomes your life, not the truth. So we take the client from this story to figure out what the darkness, what the desire, what the creative principle is. In that story, there's a creative principle, there's a darkness, there's a puzzling nature to them that they don't necessarily know how to unwrap yet, but your questions get them there. And then all of a sudden, it loses its meaning. They attach a new meaning. It expands consciousness. They have an aha, and now all of a sudden their life changes and they drop the weight and they find the guy and they get the job. And it wasn't because they ate vegan, and it wasn't because they had grapes on Tuesday, and it wasn't because they exercise on the treadmill 3 times a week. Sorry to break it to you. And it surely isn't because you got an extra few zeros in your bank account. It's very sad for people to think that. So it's a reflexive action where we go out, then we go in, going back to that circle and that spherical, right? We go out, we go in, we go out, we go in, and we're constantly in this reflexive action of outward and inward. And that's why growth is not linear. it's spherical and circular. And the beauty of this idea of that shell that I showed you, that's nature's number, the golden mean, the phi number, the golden ratio. It's the number of nature. All the spirals in nature are that. That's why I love that sentence. What's puzzling you is the nature of my game. The nature of ourselves, of everything around us, is circular and spherical. Yet we want to put it on this straight line, like if we're supposed to be in order, and failure is associated with where we fall there, when really it's just a collapsing in of all of it that's always been. So we buy into an illusion of truth, something that you or your client has believed for so long that now it's become their truth. And a new belief requires a new illusion. Sometimes I'll tell my client, let's buy into a new illusion, a new delusion. This is the delusion you have, let's find a new one, it's okay. But let's expand consciousness around the current one, because that's the one that's not allowing the behavior change, which is the square. The question is, what are you willing to give up for a new belief? One of the things about Rosa's story that I mentioned was she's got every pill, every powder, every book, every YouTube video. And I said that intentionally. Are you willing to give up a worldview that there is a diet, that there is a savior, that there is a book, that there is a new technique? Because the answer is not external, right? If we're talking about a belief, it's internal. So the one you want, that book or that pill or that YouTube video, you haven't created it yet. So you've got to create it. You got to go here to that darkness, to that creative principle, figure it out inside, pull out that truth, and then you create it and you put it out into the world. Then it will exist. And lo and behold, you won't need it anymore. So we have a very small circle. And it's rooted in a delusion and an illusion of something sacred that really has no personalization, but we've attached something to. So in order to get this new worldview, which again, will have some level of delusion in it, right? All beliefs are limiting, so something, but now it will get you out of your current day dilemma, is what is your limiting belief about the worldview that holds you, and we'll just use Rosa, in a caregiver role that must be overweight. We're caring for herself. We're just going to use that framework for a moment, is the only one she can buy into. Then the behavior, the problem typically the client comes for, sustained. That worldview is sustained by that problem. And as the trans-theoretical model of behavior change states, you can get to maintenance, termination, and inevitably relapse. And I think the last time I checked the obesity statistic is that within 5 years, people have gained all the weight back. There's even statistics on lottery winners that within a few years, they've lost all their winnings. No worldview changed, no belief change. They attached to the sacredness of that behavior and the belief that they bought into, that they were taught and they gave value to. So in order to update the consciousness, you need a new belief that then leads to the new behavior. Now I mention here, shattering a once held illusion typically includes grief. This is part of the component. When I cried on that piece of the labyrinth, I did not know the level of grief and despair that I was going to go through. Shattering this with a client requires some grief. I actually build these into my client's structure and I call them death days, so that they're aware that grieving their unlived life is necessary. That is not a failure. That is a part of the component moving forward into spiritual growth. That grief leads to a new meaning. That's how we make meaning. So one of the things that you could do with clients is tell me a story. You can get those cubes, you can ask them a story, 1 or 2 lines, 5 minutes, whatever you need, you're going to practice. and find out what they've made sacred in the story. Something mortal must die, something that they're willing to let go of, so something new can emerge. There's a grief issue there. One of the things I put was the significance of the problem, a pattern, and a number. If you start identifying a pattern, you've been working with a client for several weeks, several months, and you've seen, oh, every story is about a boss that is horrible, or she's always late to work, or every boyfriend's a narcissist. You know, you identify the pattern after you talk to a client for long enough time. That's an indicator of a belief in something they've made sacred, right? The other thing is a number. Rosa can't lose 30 pounds. I'm going to get to that. Don't discard any information. It's all useful. All things have meaning when you start thinking in this way. So alchemy is the belief of taking lead and turning it into gold. The alchemical process is a refinement, that we have a conflict or a life struggle and we've refined and stripped the learning lesson, similar to the David. We've refined the marble and we've actually made a self from that. We begin with an available reality, that's the circle. The same belief is the triangle, and the new behavior is the square. That's what most people do. Hence why termination turns into relapse. It's not sustainable, and we revert back to our old ways. This is the pattern. Real alchemy, same available reality, you may not have seen it yet, an expanded reality around the new belief and acceptance of how the world is. A new behavior anchors in, you find meaning, probably through some grief, and behavior sustained. The difference is that the circle inside is filled with self. We are the central axis. It's not the diet, it's not the pill, it's not the guru, it's not the book, it's not the class. It's us. That helps us anchor in the new reality. What starts to happen in a refinement process like this is that we become the sacred. And that's a really important concept. Then if you're sacred, you're going to eat different. You're going to have sexual escapades different. Your sleep schedule is going to change. What you spend your money on is going to change. It's an imperative that the sacred becomes us. But without something in the center, no new belief, no new meaning, just behavior, you're just as in void and never with the fullness, because those two go together in spirituality. Any questions so far? So spirituality, yes.
In your experience, where do you feel, in this process, where do you find clients get stuck? I mean, if they're going along, but they're still, where do they get stuck in this?
Great question. And there's not just one answer. The primary answer I can tell you is perfectionism. When you start hearing all, always, never, I can't, and I have some of those word choices on a slide in the future, we're in the perfectionism realm. You're on either extent of the line. That is, I would say, 99% of the pitfall. And I will tell clients, if we can just move you from the 0 to the 1 or the 99 to the 98, change exists. But I would say in our Western culture, there's a statement, it's not mine, I borrowed it from a statement I heard of someone recounting a spiritual experience they had. We have what's called the greed of completion. And the greed of completion is perfection. It's not spiritual. Greed in its totality, it just is. The greed to finish, the greed to be the best, the greed this, the greed that. And that story, I can't remember if I heard it on a podcast, but it was a recount from somebody who was staying, I think, at a Zen monastery or a Buddhist monastery, and they rang the dinner bell. And if you've ever stayed in an environment like that, you know, there's a very set dinner time. They set the dinner bell and the woman was working on the garden and she looked over, Westerner, and she said, I can finish this. And the woman that was running the home walked over to her and yelled at her. She's like, you with your greed of completion, that stuck with me. Like, you can't just let the garden be where it is, right? You have to put yourself in, you have to finish, you're the perfection. Like, just the statement carries so much energy. And it really stayed with me. And I see that so often. And we do unfortunately come from a perfectionist culture. There's actually an article, if I'm not mistaken, on The Economist or The Atlantic today on Instagram about why we are perfectionists and the damage that has done. So typically, even if they've been imperfect in another area, if a new behavior is introduced or a new, I work a lot with archetypes, a new archetype, a new belief system, that's what I tend to see as the biggest place where they're stuck. And the word itself, right, is stuck, because we're not stuck, but we've attached in a failure to it, a completion, a 0 to 100, a perfection. Great question.
Great, thank you.
Spirituality is totality. So the circle, all things exist in a universal reality, all of it. Hence the devil's song. What's puzzling you is the nature of my game. We have created the duality from a monad. Nobody has a problem with it until we put a thought and a belief to something being personal, sacred, and right or wrong. And so expansion, consciousness and expanded consciousness occurs in the present, non-attachment, and not attached to outcomes. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Because it just is. Now, for those of you who have studied Eastern philosophy or spirituality, this is not sustainable. This is not sustainable in an earthly body. You can go into this state, practice non-attachment, you live in an earthly body, you live here where there is limitations. And that's important from a spiritual perception and conception to understand that. The ego exists. And so the ego and the self are on an axis, and they work in conjunction, the ego and the soul. So if you may be temporarily disillusioned, shatter an illusion, shatter a worldview, that is why there's grief. You must put yourself back together again. And the putting yourself back together again may be a much more expanded container, a thought that's less limiting, but it's limiting nonetheless. Okay, and that's important to establish. So in your circle, what's your attachment to the outcome of your change? The circle is impersonal and includes good and evil. When you have an attachment to an outcome, and I'm going to talk about outcome and process wins in a moment, right there begins the issue. Right there, you've personalized it, you've made it value, you've made it something that makes you good or bad, makes you somewhere better or worse. So from the circle emerges the triangle. Triangle symbolically, just so you know, these are symbolic languages. So if you're somebody who works with symbols, with dream interpretations, if you're into symbology or sacred geometry, these are symbols of sacred geometry of the collective unconscious, of the psyche. So I'm using this intentionally. That's why you see a lot of triangles, like in psychological work, like the drama triangle, the codependence triangle. These things mean something beyond just the earthly construct, spiritually and psychically. So the circle is wholeness in that totality of all things that are. The triangles are limiting. They're strong structures, as we see the pyramids, but they're still limited. And it tells me that something is good or bad and that I made it personal. And what I wanted to do here in this image is see how much smaller your world became when you put the triangle in it. The totality of what can be just got small. So what are you believing about yourself that makes you good or bad? So I said to everybody to make that line earlier and to put those opposing views on either side. Now identify what makes you either bad or good if you have doubt in self or a belief in self, which was one of the ones that was shared. So whatever you put, now start adding the good and the bad, the constructs that make it personal. And if you were to tweak that definition, if you had to shatter some consciousness and expand consciousness, remove an illusion around that belief that you have about yourself, because it's dictating your life, what happens? What must change? Who do you stop dating? What thing do you stop putting up with? What do you now have to go after? What are you forced to create? So this narrow-mindedness is safe. And we all play small. Now, there's two versions of small, one extreme of the line and the other. Small in an abundant way and small in a scarce way, either one. So oftentimes, I'll work with clients that are very wealthy and they're spiritually bankrupt. They're so rich, they're poor. That's a translation from a Spanish saying. So do not get tricked that because someone has so much abundance, that it's not the same as scarcity. Those are the same. The truth, those are lies, right? The truth is somewhere in the middle. And so the narrow-mindedness, even of an abundant mindset, is just as damaging as one of a scarcity mindset. They're both narrow, they're both safe, they're both limiting. This is not me saying give away your money. I am not living in fantasy land. I'm just explaining that those are belief systems to make us feel safe while we remain empty in that square. There's no anchoring to self. There's no sacredness of self in those extremes. And that worldview is serving you and your client. They don't want to lose something, they will lose something, they'll be forced to change something, they'll be forced to accept something, they'll be forced to recognize something. Usually it's internal, but it may start external and then go internal. And the square is behavior. So if you continue to put the same problem into the square, you're going to get the same answer, right? You keep going on a diet, you keep dating the same guy, you keep going to the same place, you keep spending the same money on the alcohol, you're going to get the same answer, right? What did Einstein say? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. What he was referring to was consciousness. All things are created at the same level of consciousness. That is what this is. That's where that quote of the insanity comes from his E equals MC squared, vibration. Shift your vibration, even if it's just a millimeter, things begin to change. And so if we're expecting expanded consciousness from behavior, it's never going to add up. So what recurring issue do you have? Does your client have? Right? Are you dating the same person? Do you keep going on diets? Are you still looking for the book that's going to change your life? Do you think that every retreat is going to be the answer? I went on a date with a guy, I don't know, a few years ago, and he was spiritually minded and he was going on this Bali retreat. And he's like, oh, and the flyer says, this is going to change your life. And I go, really? A 10-day retreat is going to change your life? And he looked at me. Yeah, I'm a little rough around the square edges over here. And he's like, oh, you're right. Like, sometimes it's just a question to let you see what you never wanted to see. It's nonsense to think that. Absolute nonsense. So we have to sometimes ask these questions. So let me remove that veil of illusion. So we add value to it. We want to believe it. It forces us to change. An illusion has to be shattered. We might have to create something. And one of the questions I ask my clients is the pain bad enough? Unfortunately, if the pain isn't that bad, sometimes we just won't do it. And that's okay. That's simply just awareness that is part of this. So an activity for you is, what is the action over time that you keep repeating? Is it dieting, starving, buying skinny clothes, hoping you're going to fit into them because you look at the picture on the fridge every day, whatever that is? Changing your intermittent fasting to veganism, to paleo, meal prepping. There's so many. Find the pattern. And I'm saying food, but obviously there's drugs, there's alcohol, there's sex, there's money, there's so much, relationships, right? What were you taught? That line didn't emerge out of nowhere. That line is called the line of duality. I'm going to show you that in a bit. That line came from somewhere. It is linked to a value system. If you play dominoes on every single one of your vacations that were taking place in August in Naples at the beach, because it's the only time your father took off from work, hell yeah, dominoes are going to be really important to you. And if someone comes into your house and steals your domino set, $20 value, you're going to be a little explosive about your emotions when the cop is going to be like, it's a $20 set, lady, go to Amazon. So we get attached and we wrap it up because there's a value there. And so ask, what were you taught? Verbally, symbolically, interpretively, it's there. There is a value, and that's why you have added sacredness and personalization to it. And so oftentimes people will seek the coaching when they're in the grief part of the cycle. They lost the relationship. They lost the breast. They lost the job. We saw this in COVID. Part of health coaching was an explosion post-COVID. A lot of grief, a lot of loss that no one had a new container to put it in, a new meaning, a new understanding. I think collectively we're doing that, and we're gonna move, I say forward as a spiral, with that experience, because it was just so collective. It wasn't disenfranchised grief, it was something collectively. But there were values. There was grief associated with the loss, and usually that's when someone ends up in your office. So if the entirety of everything is huge and you limit it with a thought, now see how small it is when you limit it to a value and an attached meaning, and that's your self-worth. Our world keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So one of the archetypes I see a lot, as I was when I was escaping, Luna, thank you for sharing, is an escapism, a seeking, right? I'm going to travel. I'm going to expand my wings. I'm going to have stamps in my passport. I'm going to have all these experiences, because your world is so narrow and you think it's out there. And if I just see one more country, right? Or if I meet one more guru, and it's been you all the time. But if creativity comes from darkness, if creativity comes from desire and evil, you can see why we kind of like to go outwards and not inwards. So now we're back to alchemy. We're no longer in a reality, a belief, and just a behavior. We need to establish a new expanded reality that anchors the behavior. There we add meaning with the grief usually associated with it, and our self is central. I wrote this here. No other, no map, no coordinates, no right or wrong. That line that I told you to draw are your parents' coordinates, your childhood coordinates, your cultural and societal religious coordinates. They're not yours. Yours are somewhere there. It's not the entirety of it. So from a straight line, if we start to bend it and make it spiral, we see that those components are on it, but it's not the point. We are the point. And so a lot of my teachings, I talk about the y-axis and the x-axis. The y-axis is us. We're the divine. We're the connectedness. We're the creative wellspring. Now that line has some relevance because we are the central axis to what is. We are the coordinates. We are the map. So there isn't right and wrong, it's just what we've attached meaning to. And as we start to shatter illusions and build into a new reality of what we value, not what others have told us to value, we start to have a more central sense of self. That's authenticity. That's a soul-centered life. That's a purpose-driven life. So connection, finding meaning and returning to yourself. We must return home. We must return back to self. And so, Kamina, to answer the second part of your question, perfection never allows you to fail. Perfection never allows you to leave home so that you never have to return. So leaving requires a returning because there's a humility. There is a humbleness in, oh, what I came from has always been what I am. And I direct you again to the song. What's puzzling you is the nature of my game. You have met devils on your path. Many of them were your parents. And we have to come back to our nature and recognize that it's always been us and that perfection was just fear in finding out our own devilish nature and our own darkness and our own creativity. So when you come home, and you must, you get to now give the world your creation. That wellspring that is you, that authentic self that is just dying to birth can happen. And so the perfection is linked to fear, it's linked to failure, it's linked to what if I make mistakes, what if I'm judged, what if I'm canceled, what if I'm ostracized, right? So we can't ever get back to ourselves because we never left. So grief is part of the process. I literally have death days for clients when they have these ahas. I'm like, okay, in the next 24 to 48 hours, you're going to get hit. Why? Because we start to realize our unlived life. With an expanded consciousness, you're like, oh my God, for 50 years, I've been buying into this nonsense. How are you not going to grieve something of what you've missed out on? But with each of those sort of grieve moments, and they don't have to be large, it could be literally a couple hours, it could be I overate, whatever. It doesn't have to be a massive self-destructive thing. You realize that you're getting closer and closer and closer to yourself and how far from yourself you were. They bring you back to that image of the labyrinth. When I thought I was furthest out from the center, I was actually closest. Those further circuits, I'm actually closer. So if when you walk into a labyrinth, here's the center, your first circuit is right here. You're so close, but you have to walk the whole thing. So when you think you're so close to yourself and you're so spiritual and you're so good and you're so whatever your extremes are, that's when you're furthest from self. So moving away appears, that's why it's circular, that you're further, but you're actually closer to that connection with yourself and with others and what gifts and creative wellspring you have to share with the world. So now our connection with ourself gets stronger and our connection with our unhealthy behaviors, the square, gets weaker. So the sacredness of ourselves gets immortal, and the behavior, the food, the drugs, the alcohol, the sex, the gambling gets mortal. I had mentioned that before. There's a decrease and an increase. And the increase is this sense of self and authenticity. This is also where we gain safety. Safety is inner safety. I don't care how many bars you have on your wall. I don't care the safest neighborhood with 3 policemen going around the neighborhood, and I don't care how many zeros you have in your bank account. Safety is an internal state created by a connection with oneself once one has broken and shattered the illusion of a falseness that they were living by. So grief is there. Each time we attempt to reconnect, we might grieve. The person might try 20 different diets. They may go on 20 different dates, and there's grief associated with each, but they're closer and closer to shattering the illusion of that they want to buy into. And that's when people start to chip at that slab of marble. Outcomes and process wins. I mentioned before, we have a greed of completion. It's linked to perfectionism and being good. Outcome wins are ego wins. So I just want you for a minute on your paper to write 3 things that you want, 3 tangible things that you want. A car, a house, a dog, a boyfriend, a watch, the corner office. I don't care. No one's going to know. Tangible. I can hold them in my hands. And then I want you to write 3 things that you want that are intangible, that you cannot touch or hold in your hand. But you know you want those. The tangible are outcomes. They're ego wins, and the ego necessary. We are not living in a falseness of a reality that we breathe on air and sunshine. That's nonsense. That is total what I call sticky note spirituality. Don't go there. We live in the reality. We have to pay our bills. We have to feed ourselves. We have to have sex. We have to poop. We have to sleep. We have earthly needs. So outcome wins are not bad. But if the square, which is the outcome win, is the only thing that matters, then where's the soul? Anyone want to share 1 or 2 of what their process wins are, the intangibles that they want?
Mine were love and health.
Okay, anyone else?
I said spiritual connection and wisdom. I couldn't come up with a third.
Okay. Connection, wisdom, love, health. Mine is vulnerability. That's the one I'm working on currently. And that requires vulnerability and connection go hand in hand. And so these are soul wins. So going back to Kamina's question, people get stuck when they don't have an outcome and they think the process is useless. And the process is all of it. So I want a boyfriend. I'm actively dating and I want a tangible outcome boyfriend in my hand. Okay. But the process has been invaluable. All the wisdom that I've gained to get me to the point that I'm ready to be vulnerable. So that's a place where clients feel stuck, and that labyrinth metaphor is exactly that. After the depression, after the cancer, after my hair grew back, yes, I built a school, I wrote 8 books. I'm thrilled with everything that's come out of that darkness. It's become creative. But the process is what's invaluable. So we work on both of these with clients. We don't focus on the square. And the process can't become invaluable if it's limited in a belief that this is the only way, because this is good, because this is bad, because this is what I was taught, because. So let's do with the last, we have to think about close to 30 minutes left, some coaching applications. So I mentioned before when we were talking about the difference between coaching and counseling. Coaching helps the clients work on their future goals or a new life path, focusing on the future. Okay, so we're not sitting here rehashing old. However, a quick little storyline can tell you, but the story could have been what happened yesterday. The story does not change as long as the value is attached, the belief is attached, the sacredness and the personalization is attached. So it doesn't matter if it's a story about yesterday or when they were 7 years old, it's the same pattern, okay? A new life path emerges only with expanded consciousness. Therefore, belief change and not behavior change alone. As coaches, we do not stay in the past. We expand on the past belief so we can move forward. So as I said about stories, intakes are not about rehashing an entire story. They're for listening for the real truth within it, the belief that they're trying to sell themselves on that has them stuck. what they've made sacred about their story that is not. Number one skill, listening, listening, listening. In those 4 pillars, all of those have to do with listening. So the presence is about hearing the word. And my invitation to you, when you are in a tenemos, in that sacred space, in that container with that client, there is no boundary. So one of the things I do professionally is energy healings. I read something called the Akashic Records, where I connect to the spiritual sort of energy body of the client, and I'm in their energy field. So energy healing, shamanism, these practices that are spiritual, they're just techniques, literally make us without a boundary between the other person. That's why I can feel what they're feeling, think what they're thinking, know exactly what they need energetically. The coaching environment is no different. A tenemos means that there is no boundary. That's why there's a thing called transference in counseling. So that's part of the presence of the 4 pillars. You're going to listen for words like can't, always, never, very moralistic terminology. But I'm going to give you an even better one. You're going to feel. Your body is going to tell you. I am very well versed in the energy healing arts. Expert. My body doesn't lie. I don't even have to have entered the space. The client hasn't even showed up at my office. And something in my body tells me before they get there exactly what I need to know. If you are present in that container, you don't have to do anything. Release your own thoughts, your own beliefs, your own fears, your own doubt, and let your body hit you with what the client is saying. The words that hit you are the words that matter. I can tell you that if you train with me, I would tell you in 5 seconds, you have everything you need to know about the session. That's how precise this is. So listening, 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 and feeling, feeling, feeling. Get your own beliefs and your own doubts and your own perfection out of the way. When you're listening for incongruencies. I mentioned this before. Where do they contradict themselves? When there is uncertainty, well, maybe, I don't know, because he wants me to, or my kid this, or I'm thinking about, those liminal spaces are hooks. They're opportunities for you to expand awareness because they're contemplating that value, and that sacredness is like, well, maybe sort of kind of about to shatter. You just have to go with the right question or with the right commentary. Or I'm noticing that you're being incongruent there. What's going on? What shifted? What changed? Did you read something? Did your friend tell you something at work? Where is this expanding consciousness? And then you're going to pull from that thread so that start to blossom and unfold. Listen for word pairs. At the beginning, I told you to write a line and to identify your own word pair. Good, bad, right, wrong, mother, woman, angel, devil, pain, pleasure. Overt or aggressive to passive aggressive. I'm so patient. My husband is so angry. My child is being so destructive, and all I do is create a compassionate environment. Listen for those word pairs. That's going to give you the anchoring that the truth is somewhere in there. But like the devil, they're puzzled by their nature. How can my child be so destructive when I am so compassionate? No. Tree, fruit, apple cart, Anchoring. Listen for roles, comparison. Oh, my colleague, man, she takes these late lunches and she clocks in late and she sneaks around and she gets away with it. There's some truth in that of her nature that she's puzzled by. If they say one part of the pair, my colleague comes late from lunch all the time, well then, are you always on time? If she's always late, are you always on time? Now you're working with a construct that's anchored in reality. So anchor both. You're going to see duality in a moment. Comparison is ego-based. So if I'm better than her, I'm always on time. If she's always late, I'm always early. That's an ego. That's a hierarchy. That is not a spherical and spiral. That's not a soul-based, self-centering, access, authentic essence. Once you establish relationship to whatever that is and the other, right? Now you can see where they lie. One of the questions I ask is, okay, between the spectrum of 0 to 100 of being good and bad, or being a mother and a wife, or being destructive and compassionate, where do you see yourself? What's the worldview that you see? It's probably going to be skewed, but again, we're just making process wins to move them further to self. So we have a line. Rosa is a good mother. We'll bring her back in a moment. And if she's imperfect, she's a bad mother. And so the way that she defines her good motherness is by cooking the meals, taking care of her husband, taking care of her mother who lives with her, being the best sister, the best wife, the best everything in terms of caregiving. So archetypally, that caregiver archetype for her is that good mother. So there must be a bad mother in the story. That's where you can ask a question. Well, where has there been a bad mother? So I mentioned the word liminal quite a bit. Liminal spaces are spaces that are not precise. This is a shoreline. The sand could be dry or it could be wet. The water can be coming or it can be going. That line of good mother, bad mother, if we were to lay it on her reality, when she's speaking here about, I want to lose weight, this is where I see myself. If I lose weight, I lose the sacredness of my motherhood. The bad mother in my story was my father's second wife after my mom died, whatever it is. You start to see where you can enter to start helping expand that consciousness. So the line lands on a liminal space, and that's probably where the truth is. That's the area that you can enter with your questions, with giving them the articles, letting them listen to something different, a new perspective, sharing your own story, that starts to expand the container. Wherever the story has movement. If the story has absolutely no movement, they are adamant that that is the only way that that can go, don't waste your time. There's going to be somewhere in the movement. The fact that they sought you out, there's some movement somewhere. Get closer and closer and closer to that. That's where you start to break them out of the limited views and the values that they're holding on to. So that's a discernment process. The in-betweenness is where the growth can happen. So we have a tension to move forward and in and out and back and forth. That movement space, start listening for that in their story, their incongruencies. Grief, I mentioned, is if they come already in grief, there is a room for expansion there. And if not, listening to what they would lose, what grief can have onset with, some despair, some loss. Those stories tend to be areas where there's movement, and you can dig into the grief and to a new expansion of consciousness. The connection that they've lost is with themselves. That's why I showed you that alchemy imagery, that inner circle. If it's just behavior change, it's just a square. The self is empty. But if they're starting to build a connectedness with themselves, which is what the grief is, what the movement is, what that moving away from the greed and the completion and the perfection, they start to go inward. And so one of the things, and we'll talk about that in a moment, is accountability. So one of the coach's roles is to hold them accountable. They said they're going to do something, that they do it. Because one of the things I've learned in practice, if I give somebody, or we decide collectively that they're going to I use this example, it's silly, but it's what I use, to eat 3 grapes on Tuesday. And they come back to their next session. They didn't eat the 3 grapes on Tuesday. The level of self-betrayal, the level of self-hatred, the level of emptiness, that lack of an axis of self is pretty profound. They're probably on a massive extreme of that horizontal line. So the accountability is a way to see and gauge how stuck, right? Or how perfection oriented and failure fear they are. And I mentioned before, is the pain bad enough? How bad is the pain that they want to change? They might just be in behavior because the pain isn't that bad. And so you can ask questions like, well, what's the worst that it can be? What changes when it gets that bad? And what's the cost of not changing? These are questions you can have a client journal, sort of contemplate. The process is the win. The outcome is just pretty nice. So Viktor Frankl says the meaning of life is to give life meaning. And I said before that what was missing in the TTM is meaning. So in the stages of grief, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief model, there are 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. David Kessler worked with Kubler-Ross, and after her death, he got permission from the family to add a 6th stage, which is called meaning. And he wrote a book, Finding Meaning, after he lost his son. And part of what happens with a shattered illusion and a shattered worldview, that's why it's not a straight line and it's circular and spherical, is that there's no closure. The loss is irreversible and it's cyclical. At times you're down and at times you're up, but the process is always a win. Emily Espani Smith wrote in The Power of Meaning, Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness, and we are. We believe that happiness is some destination, something in that square, and it's not. Includes belonging, purpose, storytelling, and transcendence. These are all words that have to do with spirituality, that have to do with the soul, that have to do with self, expansionness of consciousness, authenticity. And so what's missing in both the TTM here and the Kubler-Ross grief is the meaning. That's when someone gets out of that hole of despair and darkness and can create from that darkness. That's when that maintenance, termination, relapse stops and the new behavior can anchor. Meaning, it adds meaning to a necessary change. It confirms that the change is necessary, the new belief, the new consciousness. It leads us back to self. It leads to curiosity to find out, what is this nature of mine? What am I really made of? What do I really believe? What do I really want? What do I really value? In there, we find connection, oftentimes a shared experience with others that have gone through a similar thing. Not the only person who grew up in a cult. I find connection when I attend the Cultic Studies Association workshops and lectures and read the journal. Go look at that, a shared experience from my darkness and my pain. But I had to grieve that to expand consciousness around it. And that's how connection with myself occurred, and then connection with others. When we're in a point of meaning, once grief sort of has been encountered and our consciousness has expanded and our new belief and behavior has set in, now the story has a different essence. Now you're using your story to show others there are other people like you. You're not in this alone. It's hard to accept sometimes we're in the depths of it, but afterward the story has a different take and it's told differently. And transcendence connects the human race to the lived experience. Because at the end of the day, this, not the square, but the circle and the triangle is what connects us all. So this imagery is at the beginning And slowly, how we are alone in our sort of darkness, then we find connection, then we find connection, and we start to build what becomes the flower of life. And everything is overlapped. And someone said that earlier. So now mind and body and spirit and emotion and creativity and evil, it's all one. And the center is called the seed of life. That's the wellspring that we can connect to. So help clients make meaning of their change. Help them attach a new meaning to that grief experience, to that loss. That's the permission that a lot of people need and want. They want permission to let go of the unlived life. I always say I don't give permission, but I invite in that tenemos, in that container, that person to give themselves that permission. And then link the belief back to what they previously believed. If at one end of the line was all mother and the other end was all woman, and all mother is a caretaker and doesn't have sex, for instance, then how can we move that closer? How can a mother or a caregiver with a healthy sexual experience or healthy sexual life with her partner be a better caregiver? And we start to bring in what's called a union of opposites rather than the tension of opposites. So we're back to Rosa. Rosa, at 30 years old, was going to be the author of children's books. And they were all about her character did travels in hot air balloons. She had gotten a book deal, and then she got married and pregnant immediately. I mentioned she was 30 pounds overweight. So sometimes the number in the lab, the number in the weight, can give you an indicator of where the person got stuck by age, things like that. So all things have some meaning. She took on the role of mother. She had 2 children. Shortly after that, her husband was severely injured with a back injury in a wheelchair. And then her father died of leukemia. She had to take care of her mother. So when she took on the role of caregiver, she took on the role of caregiver. And with it came all the weight. And she hasn't been able to identify how to lose the weight. So she's working with me. And we're working on this belief that if she actually lost the weight, and I put this picture intentionally, look at the imagery of a hot air balloon. It rises. Weight weighs you down. And so we're finally in an area where she's able to admit that if she were to lose the weight, she might discover that part of her nature is to go. So I said to her, let's bring you back to that self. What do you see? I'm younger, I'm thinner, I'm on a book tour, I'm being invited to different meetings and stuff, writing associations and presentations. Literally, I have to move. I have to leave the 4 walls where all of the people that need her are. This does not mean she's going to lose the weight tomorrow just because she has the aha. But now it starts to give some different container from the square now, at least into the triangle, and expanding on that consciousness. So she never experienced the caregiver and the woman as other than opposites. As we move towards both truths being of truth, there's a possibility for change. I want to put a caveat here. Age and stage has a lot to do with this. Her children now are grown up. So this does not mean, because this is another misrepresented sticky note spirituality notion, oh, I want to go live my own life. Well, we have commitments in the earthly world, and we honor those commitments. If not, the backlash is going to be much bigger health problems. So this is a caveat to show that this has been lingering for a while, but her children are grown. But one lives at home and one does not. But we have responsibilities age and stage, and then others that we choose to hold on to that are not our own because we want to honor a value system and some role because we don't want the next role that's on the developmental scale. So keep that in mind as well. Practice, practice, practice. The more clients, the easier it gets. Help them identify the limiting thought, what they believe to be 100% true. Own the thought. Have them own the thought. Bring it back to what do you believe about that? I had a client tell me this the other day. I believe my life ends at 25. Her grandmother who raised her had kids at 25. This woman is 34. And she actually verbalized that. So if your life ends at 25 and you're 34 and you might live till 80, we're in trouble. So the thought, what do they believe? And anchoring it into words so that we can start expanding on that thought and finding otherness that exists around that belief system. Desire, the pair, the 0 to the 100, the perfection. I believe this, therefore I'm not that, right? If my colleague is always late and I'm always on time or early, I'm better, I'm different. There's something there that's trying to move, but I'm having difficulty seeing that it's okay to be late sometimes or scam the clock sometimes or not come to work sometimes, right? Whatever the movement that can exist. In a case like Rosa's, for instance, where can you tell me in your family that there was a woman or a mother that wasn't available all the time? What happened? What's the story that you're holding on to? There's something that's anchoring that belief in. Asking where they are on a scale of 1 to 10 and how to get them from a 1 to a 2 or a 10 to a 9 and holding them accountable for that small shift and seeing where they are. One of my favorites is yes and. Thoughts are limiting. On the slide of the triangle, the first thing I had was a bullet point that said all thoughts are limiting. Thoughts are limiting by nature. So if we know we have to buy into a limiting thought, what else can we add to it? Yes, I feel I have low self-worth. And what else? We start to give them permission to expand on the low consciousness thought. Everybody feels not enough, too much, unlovable, rejected, abandoned, worthless, everybody. So I had a client today tell me that she watches this lady on TikTok and she does like exercise videos and stuff. And she believes in, I think she's got like a 5-prong approach: journal, exercise, eat well, drink water, things like that. And at the end of every video, the woman says, and if someone hasn't told you today, you are enough. And I tell my client, and you know why she says that? So that every single day she reminds herself that she may one day be enough. That's the only reason that lady's saying that, is to hear herself so that maybe she could believe it one day. So we all have limiting beliefs. What we can do is expand on that. Yes, I feel worthless, except when I eat well. Yes, I'm worthless. And I feel really wonderful about myself when I save $20 a week from my paycheck. We attach to the belief. That's a yes and. Oftentimes we don't do that because we're afraid of gaining or losing something that we're not really sure what to do with. If I gain this belief in myself, does that mean now I have to fill in the blank? This is an example of yes and. I'm not going to say it's part of what I've said, but you'll have this in the PowerPoints. It's just an example of yes, I must be a good mother and sacrifice myself like an all the time, or sacrifice myself only 5 hours a day. That's a yes and an and. You're still sacrificing, but now you're giving yourself some expansion room. Expanding the thought, helping clients understand that they don't want to perhaps change their belief system because they're gaining something that they might have to put something out into the world and be ridiculed, or they might have a wardrobe identity that won't be accepted. So when them being overweight and wearing black all the time is safe, but if they actually got skinny, they might be wanting to wear fluorescent, and that's a no-no. So this play on what I gain and what I lose, and it's not only weight loss, that's just the example that I've been using. Who will meet your needs? Our problems are oftentimes self-imposed so that somebody else comes to save us and meets our needs. Now you don't have that problem. Who has to meet your needs now? Well, you have to stop needing something or someone that you deem invaluable. And then you think you're going to hurt that person. And why do I need the change? That's a great question. Why do you need to have this outcome? That will give you a lot of insight to the client and where they are. If you can give examples of culture or literature or other, even if it's pop culture, but other cultures or other communities, societies where things are done different, that starts to expand consciousness. Doesn't mean that behavior change is imminent, but it can begin. And in this case, drawing a picture, having the client draw a picture of what it looks like to be able to do both. When we have beliefs, they are manifest. Thoughts are manifest form. We just can't touch them. Kindness and grace, vulnerability, it's like we know them when we see them, right? So there is a form to them, but when we have them put it on a picture and say, draw you doing this and that, all of a sudden it's like, oh, this can actually exist. Accountability, accountability, accountability. That is a big role of the coach, is having them commit to something and keeping their words. We want to see how much the self-sabotage is or how much the betrayal is. So small, when I tell you literally, I tell a client, eat 3 grapes on Tuesday and come back and report, that's how small I'm talking. So if they can't journal 5 minutes a day or eat an apple a week, and one thing I will tell you about accountability, do not say every day or never. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 5 minutes, but every day for 5 minutes, that is pure, utter, there's going to be failure because they want that. So even if it's 6 days, but don't give never or always. Those are really key things for accountability. And help them make meaning. Help them make meaning to what it is and to anchor things in reality. So if they're saying, I want to be a good wife, well, then define a bad wife. Because if you don't have a comparative value on that scale, how do you know that you've moved anything? The always and the nevers and the zeros and the hundreds is what keeps us in the perfection and not having to change. And then how can they be a better, whatever the role is that they're holding on to, that's their identity, if they actually change?